Hi everyone, my name is Carolyn and welcome to my new series called As I See It. I normally do videos about my life, my experiences, my thoughts, everything about being a woman who gave up the rat race and finally said no to the American dream to live in an RV. And my passion and my education has always been politics, civil rights, cultural issues. And if you'll remember a couple videos ago, I talked about my choice to not make any major decisions until the next election because I'm worried about the Trump administration and what's going to happen to our rights. And that really sparked a lot of support and encouragement about talking about the things that I'm really passionate about. You'll remember in that video I talked about my education. My undergraduate degree at Berkeley is political economy of industrial societies, with a focus on Russia and the Cold War. Since I studied the Cold War, I also studied a lot of American history. I'm kind of a geek. I like research, I like fact-checking, and I like history. So what I'm going to be doing in this series is talking about cultural events and current events and civil rights and a lot of things that are happening in our country, but I'm going to be going back and giving historical context. Because there is so much misinformation floating around on the internet these days, I'm being very careful. I have a background in history. I study history. Still, I'm a political junkie, but I'm going to be really making sure I fact check everything that I talk about. So I've already spent weeks fact checking what I'm about to talk about today, and I will be doing the same for all of my As I See It videos. And it's called As I See It, if you'll recall, because this is just one person's view. This is just my view based on the historical context, my views, my experiences, kind of all wrapped up into what I think about what's going on in the world today. There will be, in the description of the video, there will be a playlist and a list of all of the sources that I use to fact check what I'm going to talk about today. But I encourage you to fact check on your own. If you don't agree with something I say, go ahead and fact check it on your own. And I also welcome debate. I welcome different opinions, but they have to be based in fact. I am not going to debate somebody who gives me sources that are known conspiracy theory sources, known alt-right or alt-left. I want facts, and I will be more than happy to debate you if you come to me with facts. Same in the comments. Please make all of your discussions respectful, no name calling, and fact-based. And I hope that we can open a healthy, mutually beneficial and educational dialogue about some of these issues. That's my goal. My goal is not necessarily to totally slander Trump or the Republicans or the left wing or the right wing, but my goal here really is to help open up our eyes to how history affects what is going on today. So that's what As I See It is going to be about, and I hope you enjoy the series. These are going to be the Tuesday videos so that I can give my viewers who are just here for RV life a choice to not listen to politics if they don't want to. But let's get started with our first As I See It topic.
There ain't nobody gonna do it for you. Got to find your own.
So today I'm going to launch my series As I See It, talking about monuments, and specifically the Confederate monuments in the United States. I'm going to talk about the history of these monuments, starting with the founding and the history of the Confederacy, or the Confederate States of America, the Civil War, what the monuments meant after the Civil War, and this current movement. Actually, it's not so current, but the movement to tear the monuments down, especially most recently after the George Floyd murder by a police officer, which is a trend in the United States, and things are kind of bubbling over and people are angry, rightfully so. And so I'm going to be taking a very honest, frank look at history. And again, all of my sources for fact checking will be in the description. So yeah, I'm standing next to this giant boulder near my camp here because I thought it was symbolic. Many of this in a way is a monument, right? It's a monument to nature. It's a monument to what's going on around it and what has gone on around it. You'll see that there's some marks in it that are probably man-made. There are some petroglyphs on some of the rocks in this area. The thing though about this rock and the marks that are on it is if a geologist came and studied this rock, it would get a pretty good, straightforward, honest view of the history of this rock and even the history of the area. This is a monument in its purest, most natural form. And interestingly enough, most monuments are made out of some kind of stone. So I'm standing here launching this video about monuments next to a monument in its most natural form. The thing that sets this apart from the monuments of the Confederate soldiers that populating many of our cities and public spaces now is that this history is pure. Like I said, if a geologist came and studied this history, it would get a pure look at the history of this rock. That's not the case with the Confederate monuments. In the case of the Confederate monuments, their history has been warped over time by the people who wanted us to view those monuments in a very specific light. So I'm going to talk about that. In order for us to understand what's currently going on in the current anger over the Confederate monuments, I think it's first important to study the history and where these came from. What is the Confederacy? Well, the Confederate States of America started in 1860 with 11 states who decided that the election of President Lincoln was an act of war against the southern states. So they drafted, I think it's called like the Articles or the Declaration of Secession. And that's what started it all. They started meetings throughout the South. They decided that they weren't happy with what the direction that the United States were going as embodied in the election of Abraham Lincoln. So think about that. The United States of America was built upon an understanding that the states would be united. And we have a constitution, we have 3 branches of government that help us all live together under one constitution, under one umbrella, under the United States of America. 11 states decided they didn't like how that was going because it wasn't favoring their economic system, their cultural system, which was based on slavery. Slavery was something and this is the 1860s, something like a $3.6 billion industry in the South. The South grew tremendous wealth through cotton and tobacco, and it created many millionaires. It created business and industry, all on the backs of free labor. Their whole culture was about free labor. So think about that a minute. So if your whole economy, your whole culture revolves around free labor, and then a president is elected who what did they say? They were afraid that he was gonna take away their slaves and force white women to marry black men. That's what the Southerners were afraid of these 11 states, these secessionist states. And this is one of the things I'm having a hard time understanding. It seems to me that it's mostly the conservatives who are wanting to protect the monuments, who are justifying their very existence. But they literally went to war against the United States because they didn't like the president that was elected. It seems a little ironic considering where we are today, with the majority of voters not voting for the president that's currently in office. Imagine if the blue states, California, I don't know how many, California, Vermont, New York, there's a bunch of blue states, Colorado. Imagine if the blue states decided that President Trump being elected was an act of war and took up arms against the United States. Would you feel that's justified? Because that's what you're excusing in the case of the Confederates. So these 11 southern states decided that they were going to secede from the United States of America because they were afraid that Lincoln, who by the way was not anti-slavery, his only purpose was to save the Union. There's a quote of him saying that he wanted to save the Union with or without abolishing slavery. So, you know, the Northerners weren't saints either. The Northerners also owned slaves. But I think the difference is that the whole entire economy and culture of the South depended upon enslaving and owning human beings. $3.5 billion industry, over 4 million slaves were owned. And in order to justify that ownership of another human being, there had to be a culture of white supremacy, right? You can't justify owning another human being and think that you're equal to that human being. Just is counterintuitive. It's counter to everything moral and religious. It's counter to everything. So how did these deeply religious Southerners get around that? They just declared that black people weren't really human, that literally they were workhorses. And so deny it all you want, that is white supremacy. And there are many quotes from very prominent and political Southern men who talked about the supremacy of whites. That's how they were able to own other people, by declaring that they were supreme over black people. To deny that the Civil War is about white supremacy, or to deny that this country, the North and South, was founded on white supremacy, is to deny history. It is to deny the history of people who don't have white skin in this country, people whose ancestors were owned by other human beings. So this idea that they were going to secede because their culture of white supremacy and their economic system of free labor in the form of owning other human beings was at risk. And in fact, the Constitution of the Confederate States of America, the 11 states who were going to secede, the Constitution specifically called out that slavery would remain protected under federal law. That was in the very Constitution of the Confederate States of America. So how can you deny that the Civil War was about anything but slavery? Yeah, it was about state rights, the state right to own other human beings. So the Southern slaveholders actually believed, and this is a quote, African slavery is one of the great organizing institutions of the world, far superior to the free society of the North. And I read further on this, and there are quotes by Southerners who think that the Northern man, the Northern farmers, are completely uncivilized because they do the hard labor themselves. That's how much owning other human beings, white supremacy, supremacy over other human beings, was a part of this Southern culture. And again, in order to enslave another human being, you have to reign supreme over them, right? You have to say, I'm better than them, they're less than, in order to justify that. So white people, you know, being all Christian that they were, they had to say blacks were inferior to whites, and that's why they were able to justify owning them. Can we agree on that? That in order to own other human beings, you have to convince yourself that that human being is less of a human. Can we agree on that? Nobody today thinks that owning another human being is right. But back then, because it was so ingrained in culture and economy, they did. And in order to do that, they had to say they were superior. And so what is that? If you're superior to another race, you're supreme. White is supreme over black. That's white supremacy, which is the foundation, again, of the culture and the economy of the Southern states. And I want to say, it's not just the Southern states. We're going to talk about that in a minute. You know, George Washington owned slaves. You know, Lincoln wasn't a saint. Lincoln, you know, yeah, he he abolished slavery. He didn't really free the slaves. And I think that's going to come up again later in this video. You know, the whole country basically was based upon white supremacy and enslaving black people or brown people in order to build this country. So I don't know that anybody can deny that. So on April 12th, 1861 at Fort Sumter, Lincoln was trying to get supplies to his Union troops. Here's another whitewashing, I think, of history. They're not Union troops, they're United States of America troops. This is the United States of America fighting a treasonous force. They were denying the Constitution, they were denying the United States, they wanted to pull away, form their own government, which is treason. There's no other word for it. If California and New York and Vermont and all the blue states decided that, you know, Trump being a president, and there's, you know, I'm thinking about all of the posters I've seen throughout the country. He won, get over it. He won, get over it. It's not what they said. That's not what you're saying that the Southern slave owners should have said. They should, you know, I don't hear you saying they should have just got over it. No, we're celebrating treason. We're celebrating traitors. This is going to really piss a lot of people off. But the 11 states, the Confederate States of America, took up arms. April 12th, 1861, Lincoln was trying to get supplies to the Union troops at Fort Sumter. There was a bickering over it, and the Confederate soldiers fired shots. The Confederate soldiers took up arms against the United States. If that's not treason, what is? The action of tearing down statues is causing you to call left-wing people and Black Lives Matter traitors and fascists. Imagine if the blue states took up arms against Trump. Would you celebrate it as states' rights, like you're celebrating states' rights of the South? No, I don't think you would. So that's what started the Civil War. The Civil War was started by Confederates firing shots against the United States of America. And we now have hundreds, maybe thousands of monuments across the country celebrating those people, those soldiers who took up arms against the United States, waged war against the United States, in which I don't know how many thousands, maybe millions, I don't know how many people died in the Civil War. I'll look that up and put it here. So if we're going to celebrate traitors against the United States, people who wage war against the United States, killing Americans, why not put up a statue of Osama bin Laden at the World Trade Center? How is it any different? Or the Japanese who bombed Pearl Harbor. I don't see any Japanese soldier memorials at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. So why is this different? Because they used to be part of the United States? They stopped being part of the United States when they drafted declarations of secession and created their own constitution and took up arms against the United States. We are celebrating traitors. It's starting to rain, so I had to come inside. So we all know how the Civil War ended, right? So the southern states lost the Civil War. So I have another question. Why are we celebrating losers of a war against the United States? Does that make any sense to anyone at all? And I know a lot of people say it's about heritage, it's about preserving our history, it's about remembering our history. If that's true, then again, why don't we have a statue of Osama bin Laden at Ground Zero? Part of our history too. I don't understand that reasoning of heritage and preserving our legacy, at least in the current form that it's in. And I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about why we believe. So they lost, so the Southerners, the Southern Confederate States lost the Civil War.
So now I realize that some might be extremely offended by my harsh and blunt language about the Confederacy and the loss and the traitor talk and the losers. I understand that, and my goal here is not to offend anyone, and I apologize if you are offended by it, by my very frank talk about this issue. But if you are offended, if you're feeling this anger gurgling in your gut at my words of calling maybe your ancestors traitors and losers, and something is gurgling inside of you, and you're finding yourself being very angry because this is your heritage, right? I invite you to think for a second that if my words are upsetting you about your ancestors and your heritage, imagine what every Black American feels going about their lives under the shadow of monuments celebrating men who were willing to die to keep owning their ancestors. I hear a lot, it's ancient history, get over it, that, black people today shouldn't be affected by slavery. It's, ancient history, we don't really have racism in this country anymore. I mean, these are the arguments that I hear on a regular basis. But if you're feeling triggered by me calling Southern Confederates traitors and losers, imagine what a black American feels every time they encounter a statue of a man. And these statues are celebrating them. And I'm going to get into in a minute about how the conversation or how the narrative was changed about these, Robert E. Lee and all the other Confederate soldiers and people who were involved. But imagine being a black American going through life under the shadow of a celebration of men who wanted to keep them as property. I understand that these are some tough topics. I understand that it might cause some emotion and even some anger. But if you're feeling anger as a white American, maybe a Southerner, this is what black Americans face every single day under the shadow of white supremacy. So don't get me wrong, Lincoln was no saint in all this. Lincoln was definitely not all for civil rights and full equality of black people, of former slaves. Remember, he didn't care whether slavery was abolished or not. All he cared about was preserving the United States, preserving the Union. And in fact, what happened after the Civil War is that he just wanted to make nice. He just wanted everything to go away. He wanted the South and the North to, let's just all get along. And so what happened is nobody, I think only one person got charged with treason and did, I don't know, a couple years in prison. But nobody got charged with treason because, and this is what happens. This is a prime example of white supremacy. The people who actually took up arms against the United States, the traitors, the people who committed treason, were pardoned. While the black people, so did you know this? The 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment is what abolished slavery. So here is Lincoln not really caring about making sure that blacks have full equality. He didn't want to give them the vote. He didn't want integration. He definitely didn't want to allow blacks and whites to get married. He was not for civil rights. So this whole white supremacy is not just a Southern thing. The entire United States, dating back to the 1600s, had African slaves. The entire country. So the entire United States of America is based, and in many cases built upon, the premise that whites are supreme over blacks. Okay? And here is a loophole to the 13th Amendment. So the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. What does that mean? That means if you are convicted of a crime, you can then be forced into slavery again. So what happened during Reconstruction? All of a sudden, the system, which is run by white, the law, the police, the judges, the legislatures, all run by white people, allowed for the rounding up of freed black people for minor offenses like loitering, like petty theft, probably even made up crimes, so that they could continue to enslave them. So think about that. After the Civil War, 150 years ago, whatever, they started rounding up black people for minor offenses, putting them in prison so that they could continue to enslave them. Guess what? That's still happening. Our prisons are full of mostly black people. And did you know that giant companies, I think Victoria's Secret, I think JCPenney was one, are using free prison labor for their companies. Did you know that? I'll put a link below so that you can fact check that. So when I could go on for days about this. When we talk about how equal our society is today and how far we really are removed from slavery, these are the things. This is why history matters. This was an amendment to this was a loophole to the 13th Amendment that allowed white people to keep owning black people like property. And so there was during Jim Crow and during Reconstruction, there was a campaign literally painting black people as evil monsters, as less than human, as people who are prone to crime and prone to rape and prone to violence. Sound familiar? And it was all orchestrated so that they could continue to enslave black people after the abolition of slavery. So Reconstruction started, Lincoln wanting to make nice with the Southern traders, glosses over that. They continue to round up black people, keeping them in slavery. Lincoln allows this. And so what happens after the Civil War? Why now? Why here we are 150 years later? Why are we here still insisting that the Civil War is about states' rights and not about slavery, given all of the history that I just gave you? Well, did you know that there was a concerted effort by a couple Southerners, the losers, by the way, to rewrite history? It was a coordinated effort to rewrite history because they wanted to memorialize. They needed a way for Southerners to feel okay about their men dying, their husbands, their brothers, their sons dying. So they wanted to rewrite what the war was really about and make it more romantic, make it more valor, because once they lost the Civil War and blacks were supposedly freed, they were proven wrong, right? They were proven wrong that slavery is not right, that white supremacy, at least in that respect, is not right because they lost. So they had to give their cause another reason, a more noble reason. So these two Confederates, former Confederates, these two Southerners, started a movement called the Lost Cause. And this lost cause is what makes us think many of the things we continue to think today about Southerners and the Civil War. This lost cause was an effort by these two men to distort history, to glorify the soldiers who fought for the great Southern way of life, the great Southern culture, slavery and white supremacy, by the way. And they painted slavery as a benevolent institution that helped both blacks and whites. In fact, in some of the textbooks taught that slave owners, plantation owners would have these wonderful grand barbecues with feasts and music and dancing, and the slaves would dance and they'd be jolly and happy. This was literally written in a textbook for school in Georgia. And that textbook remained in circulation in school until the 1970s. And from what I understand from one of my sources, some of those books are still in circulation today in the South, glorifying the soldiers who fought against the United States and painting slavery as a benevolent institution, helping both blacks and whites. And I've read some of the propaganda about that. They paint, again, the blacks as inferior. Black people are an inferior race. They don't know what's good for them. They would self-destruct on their own. They'd go down crime and they wouldn't be able to take care of themselves. And so we're doing them a favor by enslaving them because we're taking care of them. And the textbooks and a lot of the books and a lot of the history was rewritten to say that. And then the Lost Cause was taken up in 1894. What is that? 20-something years after the Civil War. A group of elite Southern women, antebellum, the elite class, decided they wanted to take up the cause of the Lost Cause. And they started literally rewriting textbooks. They took up a whole campaign. They had influence because they were the elite. They had the money. They were the moneyed class. They had power with politicians and school districts in Washington. They literally started rewriting textbooks. They started censoring any textbook that talked about the Civil War and slavery. in factual terms, in real terms. They censored it, they banned it, they redacted information from textbooks, and they said, no, this cannot be taught in schools. They literally took on the cause of rewriting history. If we want to save our history, if we want to preserve our heritage, don't you think it makes sense that we understand the truth about that history and that heritage first? These United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1984, who took up the whole cause of the lost cause, are the ones who also started lobbying governments across mostly the South to start erecting monuments to honor these heroes of the South who fought against the United States in the Confederate Army. Completely whitewashing, completely lying about what the war was really about. And to quote Jeffrey Robinson, the ACLU's top racial justice expert, and there's a video, beautiful, brilliant video, not beautiful, a brilliant video that I watched, ACLU, I'll put a link in the play, it'll be in the playlist below. To quote him, he was like, if you don't believe me, if you still, after hearing all this, don't believe that the Civil War was fought over slavery, let's hear from the people who actually fought it. Many of these quotes are from the actual documents, the actual orders of secession of these states. These are the actual reasons they gave in 1861 for seceding from the United States. So do you believe now it's about states' rights? Some romantic idea of states' rights and not about slavery? It was about slavery. It was about white supremacy. It was about preserving a way of life that was all about owning other human beings. And in order to own those human beings, they had to reign supreme over them. How can we deny this? How can we deny this, given all this history, all this information, and all these facts? So the United Daughters of the Confederacy literally took up the lost cause, right? Literally took up rewriting history in order to memorialize and celebrate the soldiers who died for the cause of slavery, but they didn't want to admit that it was all about slavery. They wanted to make it more valiant than that. They wanted to make it more valiant than we died because we want to own other human beings. So they literally rewrote history. Another part of rewriting history and changing the narrative by the United Daughters of the Confederacy was to start erecting statues. And did you know that there is a statue to the Confederacy in Arlington National Cemetery that depicts a slave, a mammy? Yeah. And so this United Daughters of the Confederacy, some of them actually daughters of men who died in the Civil War, literally set out to rewrite history, and erecting statues was part of that campaign. Statues started going up of these Confederate soldiers. And don't you think if it was really about celebrating the South, if it was really about remembering history, don't you think these statues would have gone up immediately following the Civil War? And instead, they started being erected 30 years later. So again, these statues are not about truth. They're not about history. They're not about fact. They're about a version of history that has been proven to be largely 100% inaccurate, to be kind about it, actually false. They're lies. So these statues represent a lie. So they're not about state rights. They're not about heritage. They're about painting a picture of the South that is completely false. So for years and years and years, these statues started going up all over the country. As late as 1970s, a statue of a Confederate soldier was erected in Baltimore, Maryland. Okay, now I'm going to let that sink in a minute. There was a Confederate statue erected in Baltimore, Maryland in 1970. Seem a little odd to you? First of all, Baltimore, Maryland did fight in the Civil War, but it had 3 times more Union soldiers than Confederate. 3 times more Union soldiers than Confederate, for one thing. So it's not a southern state, and yet in 1970, a Confederate statue was erected. The second thing about that is 1970, I mean, that's a full 100 years after the Civil War. Why are they still erecting Civil War monuments? That'd be like erecting a World War II monument today. Seems a little odd, right? So what was going on in 1970 that caused this, you might ask? Brown versus the Board of Education is exactly what was happening during that time. And what's Brown versus Board of Education? It's the Supreme Court case that said that school segregation is unconstitutional. So look at this chart, and you'll see that these statues started going up during Jim Crow, during many of the civil rights era, civil rights fights in our recent history, you know, since the Civil War, that these Confederate soldiers are going up when there's a lot of lynchings in the South, when Supreme Court cases giving blacks equality start getting passed. So I ask you again, if it's really about history and heritage, why then are these statues of people who fought to own black people, why are they going up on public lands right when blacks are starting to make progress or starting to assert their equality in America? Seems to me that it's saying, we are supreme, we will always supreme, and check yourself. Remember your place. That's what it seems to me. If these statues were really about history, they would have gone up right after the Civil War. There would not be seeing these spikes during big civil rights decisions by the Supreme Court of the United States. It's a way for white supremacy to reign in the United States, for whites to make sure they remind black people of their place. That's how I see it. I don't know how you can see it any other way. If it were truly about history, we wouldn't be seeing these spikes in the erection of statues during some of the progress that Black Americans have made over the history. This just doesn't make sense, right? It doesn't make sense. That brings us to today. So here's where the statues are now being torn down, and the violent protests are tearing down statues. I could do a whole video, and I might, about the history of violent protest in this country. So here is how I see it. When human life matters in this country, every human life, black lives, when black lives truly matter as much as all lives, and they start listening to the experience and including their experience in our history and not rewriting history to whitewash, to glorify the enslavement of their ancestors, when life of everyone, black, brown, white, green, I don't care what color your skin is, who you love, when every single life matters, then as much as property, then maybe we won't need to resort to violent destruction of these monuments. Is there a place for these monuments? Yeah. They belong in museums. They belong in parks. Nazi Germany doesn't have monuments of Hitler still standing. No. Stalingrad in Russia, they changed the name of Stalingrad within, I think, 10 years after the fall of Stalin and Brezhnev took office, because that was a sad, ugly, dark part of history in which millions of people died, and they didn't want a statue of the person who caused that in society. Why are we holding on to these statues of people who believe that other people were property? And why are we justifying it? And I think the answer lies in white supremacy. How else can we justify celebrating people who fought and died for the right to own other people as property? I don't understand that. So, do these statues, is there a place for these statues in society? Yeah, in museums, in parks. I visited in Budapest, I visited a place called Memento Park. It was kind of fun to visit it, to kind of see that part of their history. It's where all of their propaganda statues built by the Soviets when the Soviets occupied them and the Nazis when the Nazis occupied them, all the statues of this dark part of their history live in a park. And what's the difference between these statues being in a park or a museum rather than being in City Hall or a library or a park? You can have context. In a museum or a park, you can tell a story, especially when they're all together. But when a young black boy is playing in a park and this giant statue of Robert E. Lee, who was horrible, by the way, to his slaves, treated them horribly, a young black boy plays under this statue of this man who believed that he's property, believed that he is less than his white friend. Is that right? Is that how our society gains equality? No, that's not. And what does it tell the white kid? These lessons are not lessons that we want to carry on. This is not a part of history that we want to celebrate. Do we want to remember it? Absolutely. Put it in a park, put it in a museum, tell the whole story. Don't whitewash it. Don't forget or lie about half the story and just put these monuments up as if they're heroes. Number one, they're traitors against the United States. They lost, so they're losers, and they fought to enslave. They fought to own other human beings. That is a fact. And that is the difference between a monument of a Confederate soldier and, say, like George Washington. Yes, George Washington owned slaves, and there are plenty of people in the history of the United States who founded the country who owned slaves. The difference is that owning slaves was part of the culture. I'm not excusing it. It wasn't right, but it was part of the culture. Everybody of wealth, pretty much north or south, owned slaves. The difference is that George Washington's legacy is founding the country. His legacy is not fighting to preserve an institution that owned other people. That's the difference between the founding fathers of the United States, who, yes, incidentally owned slaves, and the people of the Confederacy who fought to continue to own slaves. So do you see the difference there? I see a difference. So yeah, these statues need to come down. And I don't think I'm going to get into the violent protests. My next video is going to be about Black Lives Matter and Antifa, because I can't believe the misinformation that's floating around about that. So that will be my next video on my next As I See It. And I will probably cover violent protest and the history of violent protest in this country. But I just have to say, if you are told over and over and over again, as the blacks and browns in our society are told, that your life doesn't matter. If black lives really mattered, we'd be more outraged over their murder by the police than we would be about the tearing down of a piece of stone. A piece of stone. We would be, if we really believed that black lives mattered, we would be more angry at the unbalanced imprisonment of black men compared to white men for the same crimes. I think it's like black men are arrested at 3.5 times the rate of white men for the same crime. So our prisons are full of black men who are used as slave labor. If we were as outraged about that as we were about a football player kneeling during the national anthem, then maybe we wouldn't have violent protest. Violence is the last tool of people who don't feel heard. Food for thought. Violence is the last resort for people who don't feel heard. So maybe it's time we start looking at ourselves. If we're so outraged over the tearing down and graffiti of a monument that represents a lie, a huge, big, fat lie, if we're more outraged over that than the disenfranchisement, that word, and murder and inequality of actual living, breathing people who live among us, then maybe it's time we look at ourselves and ask why. And with that, I'm going to include this episode of As I See It, Confederate Monuments. What did you think? I want to hear your thoughts below about some of the topics that I covered in this video. I hope that you found it interesting, informative, thought-provoking. So I'd love to hear from you. Respectful, fact-based discussion is invited, and I look forward to seeing you next time, either for RV living or for more real talk. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you so much, and I'll see you next time. In the meantime, be happy, be free, and be kind. And don't forget to subscribe and give me a thumbs up. Subscribe, subscribe, subscribe. Thank you. Bye.